The Bible speaks today.
Job, I'm glad you could stick around for another segment today. So, in the story that I'm speaking about today at First Leesburg, it's the sad story about you losing all of your children, all of your livelihood, and
We don't talk about that. No, no, no. You know where that's from?
No.
Yeah, well, anyways, we don't talk about that.
Okay, I can imagine.
Skip ahead.
I mean, I do want to ask you about the process of grief because you practice the Jewish tradition of grief where you tore your clothes. I mean,
right.
How's that work?
Oh, well, yeah, no, what you do basically is you
have some clothes with you.
Yeah, I brought clothes with me. I like to bring clothes with me wherever I go, just in case somebody asks me this. And you just like rip it.
Oh.
Yeah, you just rip it like that.
That's all there is to it.
Yeah, sometimes you could turn it into like a bandana.
Wow.
Like you could do that, like I like to do this sometimes, like
Okay.
it could do that. You can make like a little like a bracelet.
And that helps you with grief.
Yeah, it's a grief bracelet. A rent grief bracelet. So anyways, that's how you do it. You just do like that.
Well, tell me more. Like when the statement is so unbelievable when you say, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." How did that spring from your lips in a moment like that?
Oh my goodness! Yeah, let me tell you this story. Okay. It's about my friend named Carl.
Yeah.
Now Carl loved colorful camels.
Okay.
All right. And Carl had a colorful camel, but it ran away.
All right.
So Carl wanted to borrow one of my camels.
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, Carl, you can borrow my camel. I was like, but I'm not sure if I want you to make it a colorful camel.
Oh, yeah?
And Carl was like, oh, no, it's cool, Job. Like, just let me borrow your camel. And I was like, okay, you can borrow my camel. And so I let Carl borrow my camel. So Carl had my camel.
Yeah.
All right, he had it in the camel countryside with his other camels because he needed this camel to hang out with the other camels.
All right.
Time passed, and I was like, man, I need to get my camel back from Carl over at Carl's Colorful Camels out of the countryside. And so I said, Carl, I need my camel back, right?
Yeah.
And so he handed me like this thing of water. I was like, no, I actually need my camel back, okay? And so Carl was like, Joe, like I don't have your camel. And I was like, no, Carl, see that non-colorful camel out in the countryside? That's my camel. And he's like, are you sure? I'm like, absolutely. So like we went out and like he saw like the mark where it was like, JC, which stands for Job's Camels, that I had branded on the camel. He's like, oh, it is yours. And so I got my camel back from Carl over at Carl's Colorful Camels in the countryside.
How does this relate to what?
Well, what I realized was that it was my camel that I loaned to Carl.
Uh-huh.
And so when I was ready to get my camel back from Carl, it was my right to have my camel back. In the same way, God gave me all that stuff, and when he decided he wanted it back, he had every right to take it.
Whoa, that's strong, Joe. I get it now.
Yeah.
Weird story, but I get it.
Yeah. Colorful camels are a sight to see, I'll tell you that.
Well, it says, though, at the end of the chapter 1 that you did not sin by blaming God. How did you resist by doing that?
Right. I want you to listen to this. It's real important.
Okay.
There's tons of shame in the blame game. You got to hold it to your name because it's not the same. Keep it tame.
Huh.
Okay?
And that
Just quote that and you won't blame God for anything.
Okay. So you kept saying that.
I just kept repeating that over and over.
All right.
Yeah, pretty much anything that rhymes with blame, if you say it in a sequence, you'll be good.
Huh. That's
I'm telling you, it works.
lame.
I tell you, it works.
Okay. Well, I know you have to go.
Yeah.
Tell us what you're doing these days.
Oh man, listen, I'm telling you what. I got in on. Have you heard of this thing called the internets?
Yes.
People connect to it.
We're familiar with
the
it.
World Wide Web.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, I get in on that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I got this website called Job's Jobs.
Whoa.
Also called Jobs.
What
or
is it?
jobsjobs.com.
What do you do there?
It's where I find jobs for people, and I'm Job. They need a job. If you need a job, call Job because the job's there for you from Job. So go to Job's Jobs or Jobs Jobs or jobsjobs.com.
And I love it. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, and maybe some folks you can help find us some jobs.
Yeah. Make sure you visit jobsjobs.com or don't because I don't know if it's really a website that's up.
Man, y'all didn't know how weird Job is, did you? Oh, Nelly. Well, we are in sermon number 2 of the Job series, a sermon series called Our Suffering and God's Triumph. And we're looking at the second half of chapter 1 today, verses 13 through 22. And we're talking about starting our suffering off right. Have you noticed that a lot of things that we start off wrong end up being wrong? When you start something off right, you have a much better chance of getting it right. This week, our 4th born son, who is engaged to be married in May, was home for his spring break for a few days. And after dinner one night, I said, Tommy, I want us to go take a walk. And so we had a man walk and a man talk. And I talked to him about marriage. And I just urged him to start his marriage off right by putting himself in last place, honoring his wife far above himself. There's a long line of people that started off marriage wrong, and then the Lord redeemed their situation and gave them sort of a comeback rally to have a strong finish. But it's so important for something of that nature to start it off right by the grace of God. And today we're going to see how, as Job's suffering begins, he started it off right. It was heartbreaking. It was as tragic as any of us have ever heard of. Yet the response matches the depth of the tragedy like none other we see in Scripture, with the exception of maybe Christ's response to the cross. And so we have an example today that will be hard for us to live up to, but it's an ideal by the grace of God for us to aim for, to start our suffering off right. I want to first of all read verses 13 through 19 in sequence as the old adage, when it rains, it pours, doesn't even do these verses justice. It says this: One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servant to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. In verse 16, while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, The fire of God fell from the sky. That's likely a reference to lightning. And burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. In verse 17, while he was still speaking, another messenger came. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servant to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. You can imagine how verse 18 is going to start, can't you, by now? While he was still speaking. Yet another messenger came and said, Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Well, I hope you're having a good day so far. This is the kind of suffering that we can't get our mind around, right? Maybe you've heard of someone that's had awful tragedy. It would pale in comparison to Job's in most every instance. Now, if you remember last week in verse 12, it says, And so Satan departed from the Lord. And then the very next verse, it just says, And one day. So God told Satan that he could test and tempt Job, but not touch his body. But everything that was in Job's hands, Satan had free rein to. And what did Satan do? In one day, he took it all. His wealth is gone, his business is gone, and most heartbreakingly and most importantly, all of his children. He went from being a father of many to childless in one day. I guess this should remind us of a few things. First of all, we can't forget how cruel Satan is. And the truth is, if Satan was ever given permission in our lives to destroy, guess what he would do? He would destroy everything just like that. So if you have any possessions and if you have any children or grandchildren to your name, it is the mercy of God that you have them. And it shows how God is protecting you from harm. For there was a test that Job was given for reasons known to God himself. But Satan's cruelty shines. Now, the real takeaway from this is, number one, on your outline, starting suffering off right involves, number one, embracing the deepest pains of life. Suffering has been around since the beginning of time. It is not going anywhere. And righteous people suffer as much as unrighteous people suffer. And so we have to learn to deal with suffering. We have to learn to embrace even the deepest pains of life in a Godward way. Now, I would point out that Satan seemed to use the winds, likely a tornado, and the lightning for tragic purposes. And some read too much into this story and they attribute bad weather to Satan every time. The Bible speaks of God having the ultimate control of weather. There are times when Satan is allowed to use weather to accomplish his purposes. Probably if there's a freeze in Central Florida in March, that's probably Satan. That's my take on it, at least. But I don't want you to read into this and say every time that there is some kind of natural disaster that is guaranteed that it's Satan, because many times that is simply nature itself, the course of being in a fallen world, or sometimes it could be the hand of God as well. We really don't know, but we do know in this instance. Now, we are people that tend to run from pain. Obviously, pain is bad and it's associated with something negative, and so we do our best to avoid the negative. But when it comes our way, we must learn to embrace it and let the full divinely intended effect of suffering touch our lives in the way that God wants it to. And we see this beautifully in Job's stunning response. In verse 20, at this, Job got up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship. That gives us the second principle this morning on our outline, that starting off suffering right involves healthy, God-centered grieving. The Bible assumes that grieving is something that we will do. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there is a time to laugh and there is a time to mourn. Now, mourning is not something that any of us are incredibly comfortable with. It's not a natural place we want to be, and so sometimes we try to speed up the grief process or act like we're okay. I think sometimes in our Christian world, we put some pressure on ourselves that should not be there. And it's a pressure for us to appear better than we really are when we're having difficulty. The word gets out in a church, in your Sunday school class, or somewhere that so-and-so has lost a loved one or difficulty has come your way. And you know that some well-meaning and caring people are going to say, hey, I'm so sorry about that. How are you doing? I'm sorry about your loss. And you sort of screw on a smile and get ready to show how spiritual you are by saying everything is fine. But the truth is, oftentimes everything is not fine. And tearing our clothes and shaving our heads, so to speak, in mourning has its biblical role in our lives. And we must let the tears flow when we're having grief and for others when they are having grief. I'm sure that what caused Job to hit his knees and fall down into the ground was the loss of his 10 children. Unconscionable, right? I was thinking about a friend of mine that lost his child years ago. It was one of my best friends from college and seminary. I touched base with him this week, thinking about him. And when we were in our sort of mid to late 20s, he'd had a daughter, and then they were pregnant with their second child, Scott Walker. They got news that the child was very sick, and he died when he was an infant, very quickly after he was born. And our hearts were leveled for them. We went to the funeral in Oklahoma City area in 1998. And this couple, Shane and Marisa, he's been a pastor for years in Canada now, they were exuding the peace of Christ. Exuding the joy and love of the Lord. Hurting. And I spoke to him this week and I said, I'm preaching on Job Sunday and when he lost his kids and when you lost your baby boy years ago. Could you tell me what you say to people? And he goes, truthfully, I will tell you this. I've gotten to comfort a lot of families that had a miscarriage and a loss of a child through the years. He's not sure, but he thinks that may be part of God's design for him as to why it happened to them. But he said, when we found out we were pregnant with him, just like with our first child, we placed our kid in God's hands. And when it became clear that our child would not live, the only thing that comforted me was knowing that as much as I wanted that child in my hands, it was staying in God's hands. And no one could take better care of my son than God. And so I left him in the care of God. Some of you may have heard Pastor Greg Laurie from Harvest Bible Church in Riverside, California. And he had the tragic experience that some of you in this room may have had happen in your life, and that he lost an adult son about a decade ago. He was in his 20s and had just come back to the Lord. Pastor Laurie says that he'd done several funerals for families who have lost children. He preached, he encouraged them, and he would get down from the pulpit and say to himself or to someone else, I'm not sure I could make it if that ever happened to me. He said that phrase many times. I'm not sure I could ever make it if that ever happened to me. And when it happened to him, he said, I wasn't sure I could make it when that happened to me. He said, but God just showed up and surrounded me with an unusual sense of his presence. And that's what must have happened in verse 20. When he grieved, it says that he fell to the ground in worship. Now, how on earth did Job pull that off? Well, I think because he made God the center of his grief. And I think, too, as believers, we grieve differently than people that don't know the Lord. That's why Paul talked about in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 that we don't grieve as people that have no hope. If your hope is in your possessions and you lose your possessions, then your grief is eternal, because that's where your identity was. If your hope is in your children, as much as we love our kids and we commit them to God's hands, if our life or our hope or our identity and who we are is all wrapped up only in them and not ultimately in God, then we have no hope. But our hope is in God if we're believers. And so we can grieve with hope. That's what keeps us worshiping and trusting him, is the hope of the believer. Now in verse 21, I'm going to read just the first half of that verse for point number 3. It says, and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. So I would imagine that Satan kind of stirred up the demons and saying, hey guys, guess what? That hedge has been taken away from Job. We got him. We finally are able to go for the jugular. Oh, what are you going to do? Maybe the chief demon asked Satan, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to take everything right, just like that. I'm going to leave his wife, whom we find out later had a hard time encouraging him. But I'm going to take his 10 kids and every single penny to his name and all of his crops, all of his helpers in the field, and the whole thing I'm going to just snag just like that. And so they're watching it happen. And so maybe, in my mind, I'm imagining that the underworld, they had like a movie night, watch Job fall. And they got popcorn, and they're just sitting there watching Job's response. And all of a sudden, they see him crying and mourning. They're like, okay, this is good. This is really good. And then he opens his mouth, and they're going, say what? Oh, Satan, I don't think that worked so good. Because he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. He's just stating a fact there that he came in this world with nothing, and it looks, as far as he can see, that he's all of a sudden got nothing again. Well, how does he view that? That's a neutral statement, but how does he view that? He says this, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. So, would Job have been right in one sense to say the Lord has given and Satan has taken away? There's a sense where that would have been theologically correct, as well as this is. Job did not know that Satan had taken it away, but we would know that. The Lord gave, Satan take away. But no, Job did not want to glorify the enemy's role in this. He wanted to squarely look at God. The hardest part of that to say is this, the Lord gave. Because when you believe that everything you have is on loan from God, is trusted to you by God, then you view everything differently. That's why some people are generous and some people are not generous. If you believe that God owns everything you have, you're holding it loosely and you don't mind giving and sharing with others and unto the Lord. And if you think everything is yours by the sweat of your brow and that you've earned it with your own might only, then there is a tendency not to be as generous. But Job was extremely blessed and extremely Godward because he realized those kids that God gave me are actually not mine. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. The third principle about starting suffering off right involves remembering God's ownership. Remember God's ownership of every single thing in your life. Now, that inspiring story you heard on the video about Carl's colorful camels actually makes a pretty good point, doesn't it? Have you ever borrowed something from someone and you forgot to give it back and they didn't ask for it back and you kind of thought it was yours? Maybe you borrowed maybe a neighbor borrowed something and they've had it for months. And you kind of realize, oh, you need that now, and they've put their monogram name on whatever it was. Or they loaned it to their kids or their neighbors. You know why they did that? Not because they were trying to steal per se, because it had been so long, it felt like it was theirs. You may have borrowed something long term and it really felt like it's yours. Those kids of ours, they very much feel like our kids, especially when we pay for everything for them, right? I know I sound like a person with kids in college, I know. The stuff we have in our house, the car we drive, the place where you live, it very much feels like ours. That's the problem, isn't it? We don't have the audacity and the courage to say this with as much gusto as Job likely said it. He said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. If your neighbor balks at you when you ask back that thing you loaned him or her months ago, they don't understand ownership, and it is yours to take back. We may not like God's cruel sounding timing of what and when he takes, but it is his, brothers and sisters, to take. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Now, what gets me is not just that principle of ownership, but the next phrase in verse 21. You could say the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, and likely many of us would be tempted to say, may the name of the Lord be cursed. Sure, it's God's. I'll give him that. He does what he does, whenever he pleases, whatever he feels like doing, but I don't have to like it. I'm quite upset at what he would do. There's an emotional side to all of us that if Job had responded this way, we probably wouldn't deride him too hard, because we would probably act the same way. Now, since it doesn't say that, it says, may the name of the Lord be praised. Something tells me that Job had had a trial or two before. And when the trial came, he still blessed the name of God. I think one of God's greatest exposés in my own heart is when something disappointing happens and I respond poorly to the small thing. Oftentimes, God wakes me up and reminds me, hey, little pastor there, if you can't praise me and trust me in the small things, you're never going to be ready for the big things. This week I was driving to go to TAG, the women's Bible study, where I was the guest speaker this week, and I get in my vehicle, and I get about, 100 yards away from where I live, and I heard this weird sound, and I pull over, and my tire is as flat as a pancake. And I think that Captain Amazing here had been driving on a slow leak for a few days, and I just hadn't noticed it. So you know, when you have a flat tire, it's either going to be $10 or a couple of $100, right? And for me, I got the jackpot. I had been riding around so much on it, I'd ruined everything in, everything in that tire. And I was, struggling to rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. It was a great reminder to me that much of what we do in life is a preparation for these types of days. Here's the thing. Does what God does it ever take away from his worth? In other words, we might say, hey, God was good to me today because I got this blessing. Okay, well, if you didn't get that blessing, is God still good? Is God worthy of praise when he takes all of your camels and donkeys and oxen as he was before, as the day he gave those things to you? If the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. We should have the courage to say, may the name of the Lord be praised. What Job wanted so desperately was for the name of God to be magnified. I think our problem is that we have such a small desire for God's name to be praised in general. But Job had a passion for the renown of God to be lifted up. That's the fourth principle this morning. Starting suffering off right involves worshiping God without exception. Oftentimes we second guess God. I don't think we like it when people second guess our decisions, especially in areas where we know more than them. One of my sons, I taught all the boys to drive, and I remember after one of my sons had learned to drive, if we were ever in the car together after he'd got his license, he volunteered as a driving instructor to me. It's like he'd gotten his own instruction company and he was the president of it. I don't know, I've become sort of an old man Florida driver in recent years. You know, when you have that turn and there's a bunch of cars coming, I now just prefer for the lane to be wide open. Thank you, yes. But for as many claps I would get some boos from some of you men, I believe. But that whole kind of swiv out in front, that's just not how I roll anymore. You know, 51 years old, right? That's just slow driving. Some of you are going, no, that's still the toddler class, man. But anyway, I'm sitting there in those instances with my 16-year-old at the time. And he's like, Dad, you got it. Go, take it, turn. I'm like, 10 minutes ago, you had your permit and I was teaching you everything. I will go when I want to go. There's not a second guessing of God here. There's a worship of God. And by the way, worshiping God is not inconsistent with grief. They can go together. That's why Paul said, I'm sorrowful, but always rejoicing. It doesn't sound like they go together in 2 Corinthians 6:10, but they can go together because you're not thankful that your kids are gone. You're not thankful for losing everything, per se, specifically for that. But you know that God is still worthy to be praised. He still can be trusted. And his worth doesn't hinge on what he's given you. His worth is ever unchanging. Many of you have heard of the great theologian in the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards. His wife was Sarah, godly mother. He had a tragic early passing, died at 55 years old. He was a pastor in New Jersey during the first Great Awakening in our country. And then he was also quite a scholar and became the president of what became Princeton University. But he only had that position for a matter of months. And he died of smallpox. And there's a famous letter that's been passed down through the ages of Sarah Edwards writing the news. It was, as you can imagine, it was hard to communicate news in 1758. And so she wrote a letter to her daughter about her dad's passing. What shall I say? A holy and good God has covered us with a dark cloud. Oh, that we may kiss the rod, meaning the rod of correction from God. Oh, that we may kiss the rod and lay our hands over our mouths. The Lord has done it. He has made me adore his goodness that we had him so long. But my God lives, and he has my heart. Oh, what a legacy my husband and your father has left to us. We are all given to God, and there I am and love to be your affectionate mother, Sarah Edwards. That's Job-like response in the 18th century. And what I want to pray for us is that we would have Job-like responses here in the 21st century when suffering comes our way, whether it's small or whether it is great, whether it sort of mirrors what we feel about verses 13 through 19 kind of trials. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. May the name of the Lord be praised. This passage ends with a beautiful reference in verse 22. It says, in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So there's a tendency to, when something happens that's bad, the first thing we know is who did it, whose fault is it? And we're a fault-finding kind of culture. This was 10 years ago recently, one of the most famous pop singers in the world, Whitney Houston, died. It was a drug-related death, and many of her fans always blamed her ex-husband, Bobby Brown, sort of a bad boy R&B artist, for getting her into drugs and abuse. And she was being interviewed not long before she died by Diane Sawyer, and she was said, a lot of people kind of blame Bobby for your troubles, and she says, the worst devil in my life is me. I've never done anything that I didn't want to do myself. It's kind of a healthy avoid the blame mentality. I also heard a story about a father who heard his 2-year-old son screaming in his room. And he goes in and sees his 2-year-old son and his 4-year-old daughter and a plastic bat on the floor. He looks at the daughter and says, what happened? And it says, oh, he hit his head. What did he hit his head on? Oh, that bat. Well, where was the bat? And she said, in my hand. She's pretty good, isn't she? We've got to see her in Washington one of these days. I mean, we're quick to look for blame, and Job looked away from blaming God. Here's the thing. I mentioned a few weeks ago in a sermon on suffering that we have the right and the privilege and the liberty to ask God questions when we're hurting over suffering. David did that. But I didn't mean to imply that it's okay to blame God and to stay angry at God. At the end of the book of Jonah, the Lord said, do you have any right to be angry at God? This says that he didn't sin against God by charging God with wrongdoing. When you're angry at someone, essentially you're admitting that someone has wronged you, has been at fault to some degree. And so prolonged anger at God is assuming that God made an error your way. So if you feel like God has wronged you, I would advise you to go to Him. And just like in Psalm 12, when you go complaining, if you're listening to Him, He will redirect you to trust Him. But it's not a good place to live with blame. And if anybody would have had, quote, the right to do so, it would have been Job. And he resisted. That's the blank on number 5. Resist the habit of blame. One of our church members had his mother pass away this week, and she was up in years, and he was grieving her death, and I asked him how he's doing. He said, you know what I'm doing, Pastor? He said, I'm parking myself in the goodness of God. I thought that was a beautiful way to phrase one's pain. In other words, I'm reminding myself of all that God is in this time, and so I'm not charging God with doing wrong. I want to remind us as we close here today that our God knows what suffering is like. He sent His one and only Son into the world. While He willed to crush Him and cause Him to suffer, we read in Isaiah 53:10, surely it broke His heart when His own Son, the sinless one, took the blame of everyone else in the world. And surely the Savior knows what it's like to suffer deeply and be hated, and yet He bore our sin on the cross and became sin for us.